Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, it's the first of two conversations with the political philosopher Alan Finlayson. First up, we're talking about the ways in which ideas get adopted, tested, and rejected. And we're discussing what's wrong with the image of that happening in a marketplace of ideas. Alan, the phrase that we're talking about, the idea that we're talking about, the marketplace of ideas, is one with a long and complicated history. And we're going to talk about some of the different ways it can be understood and some of the different ways maybe it can go wrong as an idea. But maybe we should just start with trying to frame this conversation by saying, well, let me ask you, what do you actually think it means when you hear the phrase the marketplace of ideas? What do you assume that people are talking about?
Well, I have a very contemporary take on it. So I'm really thinking about the way in which it's used quite often in online spaces to mean very specifically an entirely free flow of ideas that is governed by market choice. So I'm taking the market part of it to be not just a metaphor, but to be quite literal. And part of what I'm interested in is how the marketplace of ideas has turned from perhaps something that was a metaphor for some general sense of getting together and exchanging things to become something that's quite literally traded.
I think most of the uses we're going to talk about are metaphorical, but then some aren't. What's interesting about the long history of this is that though the phrase in English is, I think, primarily an early 20th century invention, it's been associated with positions in the history of political philosophy. And there is a case for saying, isn't democracy just a marketplace of ideas? And not metaphorically, but literally, if you go right back to the beginning, because right back at the beginning of the story of democracy is the politics that takes place in the agora, in the marketplace in ancient Athens, in the ancient world, where people come to market with their ideas or their positions, and it gets kind of thrashed out. The people talk to each other, shout at each other, try and persuade each other, and then some idea or some position wins. And if that's true, is it possible that to say the marketplace of ideas is a bad idea is by implication to have some doubts about democracy? So I'm turning this question around. So we're looking at it now through the other end of the telescope. But if you go back to the beginning of the story, is there a case for saying that the marketplace of ideas captures something in the origin story of democracy about what it is that happens when people bring ideas to market?
So I'm going to start by saying maybe, but this might be a really interesting way to think about it, because if we say that in the ancient sense, the marketplace of ideas and democracy are very closely connected, then it might become even more important if the marketplace today is something very different from what it was in that ancient period. So the period you're talking about, the market, the agora in ancient Athens, is just literally the place where people go and do trading. There's one in Cambridge, there's one in Norwich. It's just a square in the middle of town where people go to. And so the ideas might be being exchanged in that public domain, or shared, I should say, is a better word. But they're not necessarily being traded in the way that the fruit and vegetables and loaves of bread are. So can I read you something from the Bible?
By all means. That's permitted on this podcast, although I have to say, I don't think it's ever happened before.
Okay, so now I'm going to read to you, like in Sunday school, from Acts 17, starting in verse 16. This is one of my favourite parts of the Bible. Acts, of course, is about the journey of St. Paul to spread the word of Christianity. He's shaved his head and he's with his other shaved head militants going around spreading the word, and he goes to Athens. And this is what it says, Revised Standard Version. It says, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he's waiting for his other disciples. While he was waiting, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, so a different place in Athens where debate and discussion takes place on the hill and tribunals are had, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." And then it says in brackets, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. So I love that. I think that's great. And that's people who are interested in ideas. We don't know if he's put on trial in the Areopagus, but it seems they're genuinely interested. They want to find out what the ideas are. He's going to give a very important speech there later on. And so the market there is just the place where people go and talk about Epicureans and Stoics and what's going to become Christianity and so forth. That it's quite pluralistic. The Stoics and Epicureans aren't crossed. They don't try and kick him out. They just want to know what's going on, what's happening, and think about it. So I'm not saying that any of that is a bad idea. In fact, I think that's a really great idea, that we can go there and share our different spiritual wisdom, whether it's Stoic or Epicurean or Christian or whatever it might be. That seems a very good idea, but I'm not sure that's what the marketplace of ideas is anymore.
It is also the case that in the ancient world, the critics of democracy, so let's take Plato, he's probably the best known of the critics of democracy. Part of what they didn't like about it was exactly that. It seemed to be a competition between positions or points of view, which was one in which the winning position was simply the one that was best marketed or best sold. And as he suspected in a democracy, the way you do that when you take your ideas to market is you pander. And this is true. So this probably is something that connects the beginning of this story with the end of this story, that if you want your idea to take off or you want your position to command a majority among the listeners, you want to get a good customer base, what you do is you pander to your customers. And actually, these ideas will be corrupted by that process because it won't be a competition between them to see which one is the good news, where the truth is. It will end up being a competition between more or less successful salespeople, or men, it would have been in the ancient world, salesmen of these respective ideas. And so there is a case for saying that alongside the possibility that the marketplace of ideas, metaphorically at least, does have some connection through the history of democracy, the critique is also there from the beginning, which is it's not a real market in the sense that it's not any free and fair exchange of ideas so that the one that comes out on top, this is a sort of defense of the market as an idea that it's a filtering mechanism for the truth, which some people who have faith in the market believe. It's not one of those kinds of markets. It's more like a sort of advertising bazaar between hucksters, shysters, and various other kinds of con men. And that's what happens in a democracy when you take your ideas to market. And Plato thought that's exactly why democracies in the end are a really bad way to organize the city-state, because they prioritize the hucksters.
So there's, as you would expect, lots of different things going on in Plato's critique of the marketplace there. And while I'm criticizing the marketplace of ideas, I'm definitely not aligning myself with the Platonic position. So on the one hand, he's got a concern with purely what we might call spiritual wisdom, which is what I think maybe St. Paul and the Epicureans are doing, which for him requires a more patient encounter between people. And the problem there with the market is that it's too noisy. We should be out by the river or in the grove, patiently talking one-to-one with each other, working out what proper premises are and how we should be living. And that's a perfectly good thing to say. That maybe some kinds of ideas are not best done with lots of people around and the noise and hubbub of the market. But then he's also criticizing specifically political decision-making, which is a different kind of set of ideas, which would seem to me to have to be involving lots of different people, because we're talking about ideas that are going to be not about individual spiritual development, but about the development of the community, about whether we're all going to go to war or not, or all going to take part in building up the sea defenses or whatever it might be. So involving everybody there might seem like a good idea. Now, Plato, again, is not keen on that because he thinks that philosophers can work all that out much better than everybody else. But there, his critique is, I think, much more what you say, the pandering, that actually if you do that, the people who will succeed will be the ones who can just please and pander to the audience. So there we've got to think about, is it just salesmanship? Or is there something to rhetoric, which is what we're talking about here, what Plato's most objecting to, that goes beyond salesmanship? And I would argue that, well, rhetoric can be used badly. We can use all kinds of words and speech badly, and we can just pander to people and say things that are simplistic or inflaming. But good rhetoric is also about a shared conversation. It isn't just about a demagogue addressing a passive audience. It's about trying to find ways to explain things, trying to make arguments that can connect with the audiences there, and doing that in a competition. You mentioned the word competition earlier, but you presented it as what we might think of as being market competition. But in the Athenian context, the competition between speeches was perhaps more like the kind of competition we think of now between sporting competitors or in the Olympics. It wasn't just competition for market share, regardless of what one said. It was a display, it was a performance of skill between different people trying to win the hearts and minds of the audience before them. And I think that's a very different conception of competition. It's what the thing is called the agon, the competition, the display of your skill and your prowess, which gives them to the word agonism. That is how some of us think about democracy, as actually being something that requires that competition to take place, and therefore should create stages and places and opportunities for the contest of ideas, for the display and performance of ideas for audiences to think about. But that's a kind of competition that is not quite the same as who's got the best wares possible and speakers thinking, how can I get this sucker to buy what I'm saying?
Yeah, and we're definitely going to come onto that because that's one of the other interesting questions here. There are a whole set of positions in the history of philosophy which have come to be associated with the phrase the marketplace of ideas because they are about competition between ideas, but it says something about us, that we've conflated competition with market competition, and there are many other ways of doing it. But I want to ask one other question about the ancient version, because another possible way of thinking about this is it's the word ideas we should be looking at here. So I've been assuming that Plato's critique is that if you take your ideas to market, the ideas will be corrupted by the desire to sell them to the highest bidder or whatever it is. And in this case, the highest bidder is, as it were, the majority among the people if you're trying to win a vote or whatever it is you're trying to do in a democracy. But there is another way you could look at this, which is to say democracy isn't a competition between ideas. I mean, idea is the wrong word for this. You might think that a party political manifesto is a list of ideas, but actually when you think about it, that's quite an odd way to describe it. These are positions. The contest is often to win a process which results in a decision being made. So you have a position, someone else has a position, and you're competing to be the decisive position. That is a long way from Paul and the Stoics and the Epicureans and others exchanging ideas. The exchange of ideas is maybe actually a very different thing from democracy in all of its guises. So not just the Plato critique of it, but we maybe have an inflated view or just a mistaken view of democracy if we think that the primary currency of democracy is ideas. Do we want to say, so we're recording this just after, we weren't going to talk about, I'm not going to mention his name, but we're recording this just after the American presidential election. It would be odd to think that what came out on top there was the winning idea, rather than a million other words you might use, position is one, or message, or whatever it is. And so maybe what Plato is objecting to is the fact that there are ideas at play in democracy. It's all words and positions. It's all a bit superficial. It's all about taking words and trying to apply them to this thing or to that thing, often fallaciously. And the world of ideas is just a completely separate domain.
I think that's a really excellent point, an excellent question that does help us clarify what's at stake. And again, to draw the distinction, as you say, between political debate as we might understand it now and what's happening with St. Paul. And we might want to distinguish between a domain for discussing spiritual practices and salvation. You might want that to be different, as Plato certainly did. Plato, of course, is also concerned with leaving aside his specific meaning of the word ideas with correct terms and names and understandings of concepts. And I think he's probably right that that happens in quiet, more contemplative environments. So what we might now call science, we might want to take place in very different arenas from those in which political decisions get made, and very different arenas from those in which people are simply paid for the ideas they come up with. So then the question is, what's specific about political discussion and exchange of perspective and opinions, and what's the role of ideas within that? And I think I would say it is about ideas, but not only about ideas, because politics and political dispute is about actions. It's about calling for actions, things we should do or not do that we think will make the polity better in the future. So ideas are a part of that, what our idea of good is, what things might be in the future, how well we think our chosen or proposed course of action will work. So all of those are always in play. I do think in political decision making, the decision about action and whether or not we can or will carry it out is at the forefront. Behind that is a contest over what we think is going to be good or beneficial or what we think will work. And a definitive characteristic of politics is, I would say, precisely that it's not spiritual or scientific. It's where there is contestation over what is good and what will work that is not simply to do with mistakes or the wrong use of words, but because actually different people in any society have different interests and different legitimate demands that cannot all be satisfied. And so we have to resolve that through some kind of argument, which might mean some winning and some losing. It might mean that some change their understanding, their idea of how the society works or what would be good. And that's a vital part of democracy that does require contest and competition in a different way to science or in spiritual life, but also in a different way to economic exchange.
So let's talk about another philosopher who often gets associated with the phrase the marketplace of ideas, though I don't think he ever used it. That's John Stuart Mill. But he certainly is often identified with the notion that ideas have to be tested against other ideas in some form of competition, that truth and progress depend on a free exchange of ideas. So he really did take very seriously the idea that this should be free in a liberal sense. And there should be as few restrictions as possible on what ideas could be brought into the public space, whatever that space is, and heard and listened to. So he didn't want people to be spared listening to things that might be crazy or mad or offensive or whatever it was. But that the point of doing this was that in the end, the only test of an idea is whether it can survive that kind of competition or contestation. But I think his assumption was, as you just described it, that the idea that survives that will be changed by that a bit, in the sense that, you know, it will have its rough edges knocked off it. An idea is not a million miles away from the word ideology. An idea might be part of a package of ideas. And actually, if you really push hard idea to idea, you'll find that bits fall away, some bits get grafted on, and so on. But this was a political argument. So this wasn't just an argument about the contemplative life or the scientific life. This is meant to happen in the domain of politics too. It was an argument that was quite skeptical of democracy for some fairly Plato-like reasons. He was a bit worried that the way this can happen, particularly in a mass communication democracy, is that it isn't a competition between ideas. It's a contest of salesmanship. But is that close to something that could be connected with the phrase the marketplace of ideas, or is actually Mill's association with that phrase the mistake here? Because what he's talking about is really nothing like a marketplace. So I'm not sure about this. It depends a bit on what we think a marketplace is. Definitely it's competition. Is it anything like market competition? Is the winner the one that sort of survives the contest because in the end more people are willing to sign up to it?
Well, I think in Mill, again, there's lots of things going on, aren't there? But I think in Mill, partly a question is who or what does he think is involved in the competition? I think he thinks the ideas are in the competition. So I think he tends to think of the ideas as somehow standing perhaps a little free from the people who happen to be articulating them. Though at the same time, of course, you know, Mill wanted some people to have more votes than others on the basis that some people had a better understanding of the ideas than others, though also underpinned by the principle that if we created a situation in which those who understood better could explain it to everybody else, everyone else could be cultivated. So I'm not sure that there the conception is one of competition so much as one of a kind of tutoring, that the best and better are there to tutor the others to become better and best. And that's part of what liberal society is. And part of what he wants, it seems to me, certainly in On Liberty, is not just the contest of ideas, but also the liberty to pursue your own idea for yourself, to engage in your own experiment of living and be free from harassment and hassle from other people. And again, that's quite different from a debate about what political course of action we should all take. If it's about whether people can get divorced or live with people who they're not married to, etc., that's not necessarily proposing that everyone has to do that. He's just saying he should be free to try that out and see if that works and we can all learn from it or not. So it's not quite competition. It's just making clear the variety of options of ways in which we could live. And then when it comes to political debate, I think he's got very much this idea that the purpose of freedom there is to not be restricted by the old authorities of church and propriety in order to be able to spend time spreading good, right, and enlightened ideas to the masses who need them. So again, that's not, to me, a market. And I'm not sure he did like particularly the world of debate. I don't know. I know when he was in Parliament, he was said to have a very thin and reedy voice, is what the reporters say. And the other parliamentarians mocked him as the governess. And I take that rather seriously because I think that tells you something about the way in which he marketed his ideas.
But how did he think you could tell which idea had come out on top? So if it's a sort of tutoring model, you know, if you're in school, the reason you listen to your teacher is because it's the teacher. So it really does depend on who says it. It's not all the kids screaming and the idea that comes out on top is the one who screams loudest or whatever. A tutoring model does have a hierarchy built into it, even if you might hope ideally that the ideas float free and above whoever happens to be espousing them. Clearly, some people are marked out as the ones worth listening to. He is very skeptical of the basic democratic majoritarian principle that the test of the winning idea is the one that's won the majority in any given situation, and certainly in an election. That's part of the reason why he didn't like one person, one vote. That would be a terrible test of the best idea just because 51% of the population signed up to it. And also, I think he would think that's not a contest of ideas, it's a contest of messaging. This is the beginning of the age of Darwinian evolutionary theory. So there's, the phrase hasn't come into being by the time he wrote on liberty, but one bastardized version of Darwinian theory is the survival of the fittest. And in the end, what this is a test of ideas in which they just fall away as they fail to adapt to people's needs. The one that comes out on top is the one that works for people. And that might feed into what later came to be known as a kind of pragmatist view of how the evolution of ideas works. They are essentially adaptable. But I don't know what Mill thought. Do you know what Mill thought really was the test? I mean, the ultimate test is it's true. If there was a book of truth, you would just look in the book of truth and see which ideas matched it. But the whole point is we don't have the book of truth. So what is, if it's competition, how do you know who won?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I mean, he says several things, doesn't he, about that part of the purpose of the free exchange is that people become better attached to the good ideas. They appreciate them more and carry them more consciously in their minds and live well with them. I suppose he's thinking of something a bit more like the kind of scientific debate and exchange that we might have about Darwinian ideas that will win out in part because their application seems to further knowledge in some way. And you're making me wonder if that's something I should connect to his conception of experiments and living, that actually the test in some way isn't necessarily winning the argument, but is that in being free to carry out and apply that idea, we get to see over time which ones work best. But then again, there the competition isn't quite of ideas, is it? It's of ways of living, and we can all see how those work out. Do the Epicureans or the Stoics or the early Christians end up doing best, doing well? But I'm not sure that that would be so platonic in the end that we would say whoever lives out long enough is the one who won the competition of ideas.
Yeah, it would be a weird test, ultimate test of who the winner is, because there's so many other factors that can decide that outcome. It would be very unlikely it would just be the best idea.
But is there a sense in which he already does have some sense of what the best ideas are, because he's a philosopher, a sort of utilitarian, and this is really about allowing those ideas to flourish and prove themselves once they're free to roam in the public mind and be applied. And we have to make sure, therefore, that the context in which it is disseminated have some kind of order. I mean, although he is fully in favour of the liberty of thought and discussion in print and in speech with some minimal restrictions, I think he still has a Victorian idea of how we would behave in public when we were speaking and articulating ideas. And he has some sense of the rules of the game as well.
It's interesting because there are two ways utilitarianism might come into this. So one might be the assumption that in the end, utilitarianism is the good idea. It's the thing that will get us beyond religious superstition and conventions that are out of date and relying on tradition. And the good idea is to apply a kind of rationalist, 19th century advanced model of progress. The other way of thinking about it is that utility is the test itself. So it's not just that there's a philosophy called utilitarianism, which is the idea that will win, but that utility, pleasure, pain, whether an idea as it goes out into the world leaves people better off or not, is the ultimate test. Now, the first one hasn't got much to do with the market. It's almost like he's got a monopoly. He's already worked out that utilitarianism is the right idea. But utility as the test is actually quite closely connected to what's going to become market economics. In the end, the only test that you have, which is one that plays out in a market, is whether people benefit from an idea or not, or in any other kind of market exchange, simply whether they're willing to pay the price for whatever it is that you have to offer. And so there is a route from Mill through to these 20th century versions where it does become connected to economic notions of the test of something, and that the market is thought to be the ultimate dispassionate test. And again, related to Mill, these are often free speech arguments. The idea that the great thing about a market is that there aren't barriers to entry, ideally. The barriers to entry are very low in a well-functioning market. So the barrier to entry with ideas is not that rules about ideas have to achieve a certain level of respectability and propriety and all of that. You just say whatever the hell you like, offensive, ridiculous, wild, outrageous. But because it's a market, everything's in there to be experienced. And then the one that will win is the one that works for people according to some measure of whether they feel better off. So there is at least possibly a route from Mill. I don't think he would be at all happy with it. He was an economist, political economist and economist as well as philosopher, to that version of the marketplace of ideas where in the end, the only test is whether the idea is one that people are willing to pay the price for, rather than just pay a sum for, but as it were, whatever harm it causes them is outweighed by the benefits that they get from it. So there is a way, I think, from Mill into the more market version of this, even if he's not the one who would want to go down that route.
So is part of the proposition there then that we think that in Mill's case, if we say he is a utilitarian, which he is of some sort, that part of the ideas at stake is fixed, that we know what the end goal is. The end goal is happiness and flourishing, and that's sort of fixed. So we're not having the kind of debate that Plato wanted or that St. Paul was having. The dispute is about the idea of how to get there, what the means are.
Yeah, and this is a modern notion that we've come in a secular world to have an understanding that we're all individuals, we're all humans, we all have different things that we want to achieve in life, but we all agree that we want to lead a good life in those terms, happiness, whatever it is.
Yes, but that's a significant difference, isn't it? And you can see then that the ideas in question are, was in a way you were saying earlier, they're not quite ideas, but they're ideas about how we can get to these various places, either collectively or individually. And you can see that then there is a competition in there in terms of who actually has achieved happiness or maximized their utility. And we can debate and argue and make decisions and test those things out. So that is then, as you say, going to come to the economic conception. But I also want to throw in something else, which maybe we'll pick up again later, which is if you take that economic conception and a certain kind of utilitarianism, then an individual's ideas become part of their own property, as it were. We have our own ideas, which we also want to dispose of as we choose in the marketplace. And then we begin to be in a very different place where we're not really talking about there being any clear ends at all overall for society or for the polis, because the ends are just buying and selling and trading. And part of what we want to buy and sell and trade is our ideas. And there, the freedom of ideas is a freedom to trade them, which is not quite the same as a freedom to discuss them openly and work out what the best route is. And I think that's part of what begins to come in, not because of Mill, but because of later ways of thinking about the spread of ideas as a marketplace.
And what is the trade there? So as you were speaking, in my mind, what I pictured is what I think does often happen online, which is that people, they just want to be heard, right? And there may be an exchange, which is if you let me shout for a while and don't interrupt me, there might be something reciprocal in that I'll let you shout back, although usually actually I won't let you shout back. But the thing that people want to happen to their ideas or their views of the world is for them to be recognized or acknowledged. And that's actually the exchange here. So ideally, it's the pursuit of the truth. Secondary to that, it's the pursuit of people telling you that you're right and they're wrong. But even below that, you don't maybe need to be told that you're right. You just need not to be shut up and have an outlet for your view of yourself and your view of the world. But this has to happen. The solitary version of that, it's for a solitary person, it's enough just to conceive it in private and know that it is your view. But for most people, it requires other people and recognition. And that's what's going on here. It's a long way from what Mill had in mind. It's more like social interactions in which people desperately need acknowledgement.
I think that's absolutely right. Although it may not be entirely far away from Mill, in as much as one part of Mill is also the romantic, who values free expression as a manifestation of individuality. And I think part of what you're describing there is the joining of those two ideas in a rather fateful way. That freedom means the liberty to express yourself however you choose, where identity and individuality are things that have to be seen for us to know that they exist and need to be seen in public. So what we want is the freedom to do that as well, and just to be seen and recognized, regardless of whether people agree with us or not. Although I think you could say there is an element of that coming through Mill. Yes, as you say, it takes us to a very different place. And I think we have to understand that element of it to understand the way in which the marketplace is happening now, because then what's changed is not only what the ideas are, but also what's being sold, because that creates the opportunity to sell to you the opportunity to express yourself freely for a small fee.
So before we get to that, which is sort of where we're ending up, why we think the idea goes wrong in a 21st century setting, the phrase itself comes into prominence actually not in 19th century liberal philosophy, but in 20th century American jurisprudence. It's a legal concept. It comes in a few celebrated early 20th century Supreme Court and other judgments. And what has happened by that point is it's not just a free speech idea that in the marketplace of ideas, there shouldn't be restrictions on what is said. In an American context, it is in part a free speech idea. But it becomes acute because the question is not just the rights of individuals to free speech, but the rights of corporations. Actually, that is weirdly where this idea goes, that in a flourishing market, much of what is being bought and sold is not being bought and sold by individuals. It's being bought and sold, particularly sold, by corporations. And that includes ideas. So these judgments often relate to the rights of corporations to promote ideas, and many corporations are in the ideas business. They're publishers. They are people. I mean, that's one of the questions, are they people? They are corporations that own radio stations or TV stations or whatever it is. And an earlier liberal view might have thought that you do absolutely want to protect the rights of individuals to say what they think. But once it becomes corporations, it's no longer a level playing field. And these corporations have special powers and therefore there should be restrictions. But the direction of travel of American law and American politics over the 20th century into the 21st was actually, though it ebbed and flowed, this argument, towards saying that corporations have the same rights in the marketplace of ideas. And their marketplace really matters. And then you get closer to the marketplace of ideas being more actually about the marketing of ideas. So we're back with Plato again. That you don't restrict how people sell their ideas simply because they have a lot of money or resources, because in the end, the best idea will win out. But I think the reason this is a bad idea is that's just not true, right? If this was called not the marketplace of ideas, but the marketing of ideas, I think we'd be a bit more suspicious that the best idea might not win out. I mean, now we're closer to the advertising business than we are to St. Paul debating with the Epicureans and the Stoics and whoever else.
Yes, so the concern there is that the means and mechanisms by which we can promote ideas differ from simply the freedom of speech. The motivations perhaps as well change. But I think I would want to add that this isn't just about the marketing of ideas. Because we talked about the marketplace, we've fallen prey to what some would call the illusion of bourgeois economics. We focused on the world of exchange, and we've not got to what Marx famously calls the hidden abode of production. So we would also want to say, okay, now there's actually a production of ideas that isn't just a philosopher sitting by an olive tree with some students. There is, in fact, an organized manufacture of ideas. And maybe also not just the manufacture of ideas for the purposes of propaganda to win people over to political causes or bind them to the state, but just for the purpose of being sold. And that's part of what's being defended here as the marketplace of ideas, is to employ, whether it's penurious songwriters in Tin Pan Alley to produce your songs, or if it's scribblers to produce columns for your newspaper. And you're talking about also the manufacture of something perhaps in standardized forms, in rather rigid and restricted genres. So the freedom of expression and freedom of ideas actually becomes really rather a support for a constrained generation of quite generic and rather formulaic ideas that have been brought into being not because of the possible results that they might have for our spirit or our economy or our society, but because they will be bought and will generate income for someone.
Yeah, and another version of that is Central European intellectuals ending up working in Hollywood, right? And indeed, many of those Central European intellectuals were Marxists who had a very well-developed critique of the commodification of culture. But at the same time, in a market like the American market economy, it is the case that communication and expression, particularly mass communication or popular communication expression, it's fine if you don't mind how many people you reach, but if you want to reach a large audience, does tend to get filtered through these pre-existing and well-established powers. And then you get homogeneity, maybe, rather than diversity. I mean, we don't want to overstate this. There's also a lot of diversity. There was a lot of diversity in mid-20th century Hollywood. There were some great films. We've just done a series about some of these great movies. It's not all like the blandness that the Frankfurt School saw as just this sort of empty mass production, opium of the masses culture. But I mean, that as a notion of the marketplace of ideas does feel very different from this more competitive or contestatory version.
It absolutely does. And especially if we move it from the realm of entertainment or artistic expression to more narrowly defined political ideas about what should we pass this law or not? Should we go to war or not? If the ideas about that are being produced out of some sort of, as it were, factory system, according to the rules of the factory system, in order to generate reaction, that's a very different place for politics as well. That is neither the liberty of thought and ideas nor propaganda. It's something else altogether, it seems to me.
And one of the consequences of the direction of travel being towards the rights of corporations to have equivalent rights to free speech, equivalent liberal rights to individuals, is that, I don't think this is a controversial position, American politics, American democracy, the marketplace of ideas has been swamped, drowned in messaging from well-funded sources that aren't individuals and their thoughts. They are institutions, economic powers, and their abilities to influence how people experience information. I mean, I'm trying to think of a way of putting it that still doesn't sound like I'm just saying, as many people do, that there's something's gone terribly wrong with a politics in which money buys speech. But it does in America. It just does. You can be more skilled or less skilled in how you do that. And it's not simply the case that money always wins, though it is really uncanny the extent to which, maybe not at the presidential level, but at the congressional level, some people say you just need to actually see who's got the most money. And that person will probably, regardless of message, win the contest. But money is the primary currency in that marketplace of ideas.
And that's very different to what Plato was critiquing when he critiqued the rhetorical performance of dispute and debate, where, yes, people might have money to pay someone to buy their speechwriter for them. They might have money that has trained them in delivery, but you still had a moment of debate that was contained within a particular situation where people knew what we're doing now is making a decision about whether we're going to raise taxes or go to war. Whereas what you're describing is not, I think, just people funding someone to go on the TV and make the argument for this or that candidate. It's a much more extensive funding that is going to promote ideas about what the good is, how we can get to the good, maybe even what our spiritual welfare is. And that is, as you say, above all, swamping the field. So there can't really be anything like a recognizable exchange or agonistic confrontation between ideas.
And now we're in a world where many of the most vocal advocates for freedom of expression and for a new liberal economy of ideas, essentially online, in which there should be no restrictions and the best ideas will win out, who often invoke classical ideas and the history of philosophy. There is a world out there in which the advocates of free speech online are often pretty erudite. But to go back to where you started, we now have a marketplace of ideas which feels like it has quite a lot of very specific vices in it. And the way in which we are exposed to ideas in that space. Elon Musk describes X, formerly Twitter, as the town square of the world. And he says there should be no barriers to entry. Ideas should duke it out like this was ancient Athens. We're all St. Paul, or we're all Epicureans, or whatever it is. And this is the only way to a flourishing spiritual, economic, political life. Huge, grandiose claims are made for this marketplace of ideas. It is understood as a kind of marketplace. There is a big gap between the claims and, I think, most of our experiences of the reality. What do you think primarily explains the gap? Why actually is it nothing like what the evangelists for the marketplace of ideas are selling us, the new online marketplace of ideas?
So I think the best way to get at that maybe is to compare it to what these people of our age knew as the old system. I think everyone under 30 doesn't know it, which is a system in which ideas were produced by individuals, perhaps in something like factory conditions, but not necessarily, but in a way that was connected to institutions that were connected to political process. So what I'm thinking of is the newspaper columnist who is in some way constrained but also supported by the newspaper and the ethics and codes of journalism, or the party activist who is, again, presumably constrained and supported by their party, or the academic, the university intellectual, again, free but also shaped by and conditioned by the university. And in all those cases, of course, are paid a salary to do a variety of things that includes the production of ideas. Now, what's happened with the rise of digital platforms is the massive growth in what I call ideological entrepreneurs. I didn't invent the word ideological entrepreneurs, but people who are able to generate an income for themselves through the production of political ideas, ideological propositions. What digital platforms do is lower the barriers to entry. Anybody can, in principle, set up and do that. And they can do so untethered from the university or the newspaper or the party. And whatever we might think that those were bad things, they constrained and they limited the range of ideas. There are lots of reasons to be critical of that. But you could also see how that system evolved to try and connect ideas to processes of political discussion and decision making so that they could be processed by some kind of social political system. But now that's completely gone. Now you have people who are untethered from that and who have no need or reason to be constrained by the codes of conduct of political actors or university employees or journalists. So that's a big change in who can do it and in how their actions are organized. And that would be quite a change and possibly quite chaotic and quite noisy and potentially problematic. But what makes it more problematic is that they are, in fact, tethered to the machine, as it were. That if you are, in fact, making your living, as people do, by selling ideas, as it were, promoting ideas on X, formerly Twitter, or wherever it might be, you need to adapt your ideas to that platform and to the people who will watch or read or consume your content. So now you're not constrained or supported by any institution other than a certain form of very constructed market, a market constructed by Elon Musk in the case of X. Elon Musk's concern is not the freedom of ideas or the town square of the world. It's either that people watch adverts on his platform and generate income for it, or it's that it serves his very specific political interests. There's two possibilities there. It does look like the latter one might in fact be the primary concern, but certainly on a platform like YouTube or TikTok, the purpose of giving people space on it is so that they will generate attention on your platform that you can sell advertising through. So that seems to me a radically different situation to anything that we had 25 years ago, whatever its faults were, and they were many, and also to create a situation in which the production and exchange of ideas is happening for reasons that are nothing to do with our politics, although they have profound effects on how our politics plays out.
Someone tweeted yesterday, words put into Elon Musk's mouth, I spent $44 billion buying this platform and all I got was control of all three branches of the US government. That speaks to your point. I also, as you were speaking, found myself thinking, but you are in part describing what I do. So this is an ideas podcast. We think of it as a history ideas podcast. I used to work for a university. I've now decided that I'm going to try to support myself in the world by I don't think of it as selling ideas, but of course, at some level, that's exactly what it is. At the end of this podcast, I'm going to ask people to, if they really like this podcast, to become subscribers and get a bit of extra product. I feel like I'm undermining my business model here by talking about it. Get a bit of extra product in return for what I think is a very, very reasonable fee. So this is a very broad space. And as you were speaking, and you were aware of it as you were speaking, one knows what will come back, which is the world that you were describing sounds constrained and fusty and patriarchal. And, a throwback to maybe John Stuart Mill wanting to have these barriers to entry, though he pretended he didn't, so that, ideas wouldn't be too dangerous because they would be channeled through institutions that could prevent them simply being thrown out into the world and finding audiences that had previously been excluded and neglected because no one actually cared what those kind of people thought. And actually, the liberal elite were always a self-perpetuating meme machine or whatever you want to call them. And this is just blowing that up. And the ideological entrepreneurs, they do have a pretty powerful case, which is partly based on the thought that what you describe is a nostalgia of the liberal elite. And what they're offering is, for the first time, thanks to these amazing platforms and machines, the opportunity to really test these ideas out in the marketplace of ideas. And we discovered these surprising results. On the one hand, it turns out that people are really interested in serious ideas. And, the only reason it's possible to make a podcast like this one is that, to my delight. And it's always somewhat surprising to me that people want to listen to it, but people seem to like the kind of conversation that we're having. And there are many other podcasts, more successful than this one, doing serious stuff out there. But at the same time, also, there are huge audiences for things that didn't exist a few years ago in the space of ideas, and that there are ideological entrepreneurs who do seem to have constructed audiences where there wasn't one before. but in some of the ways that you describe, so that these audiences are being constructed, but also in lots of ways being artificially filtered through the means by which these ideas are exchanged. But it's complicated. I have a lot of sympathy with your position, at the same time as feeling personally conflicted. But it is complicated, and the people who are pushing back the other way, saying that for the first time ever, we have a true marketplace of ideas, and your nostalgia for something that went before is actually nothing but nostalgia. They may be wrong, but there's some force to that argument.
There absolutely is. So first, I've got so many things I could say in response. So just firstly, some middle things. I'm not nostalgic for that old system. And 25 years ago, I would have tried to be a trenchant critic of it. And I don't think we should go back to that. And I think that the mistake a lot of people make is to think that they can put all this back in the box and go back to some system. Secondly, you are an entrepreneur, aren't you, of some kind? And you're not the first person to go from being a professor at a top university to moving into the online space. Although in a different context, I might make you a case study. Though I think in your case, you're not quite selling ideas because you're talking about ideas of other people and other things. So there is a difference in what you're doing. And there's also a difference in that what we're doing now is really something quite old-fashioned. It's two academics having a conversation, which we could be doing in a seminar room or a lecture theatre. This technology allows us to do that in a way that more people can access at times of their convenience. That's excellent. But I say that because part of what we would want to think about is the way in which the platforms of the digital economy create ways in which communication will happen that are very different from this, and very different from previous forms of communication, and that are very new. The tweet did not exist, and it's not quite the same as the aphorism or the short phrase or bon mot, or whatever it might be. The YouTube video is sometimes like a speech, but it's not quite the same as a speech. Sometimes it's like an essay of a sort, but it's a different kind of thing. So that reminds us that when we're talking about ideas and their selling or marketing or manifestation, we're actually talking about things that appear in some concrete form of communication. And part of the dispute that Plato was having was about the form in which the ideas were expressed. Patient exchanges one-to-one was very different to the speech to an audience. Paul's speech to the Areopagus takes a different style to the ways in which the Stoics and Epicureans would carry them out. Mill was thinking about certain kinds of writing, mostly, I think. We have to take seriously the means of communication and how they condition the form that ideas will take when they appear in public, and how they will then be experienced and consumed. And that's another part of what has changed in this digital world, that the ways in which ideas are communicated and experienced is radically different. People won't be listening to things at the same time. They'll be listening to things probably on their own, maybe with headphones on. That's a very different phenomenological experience of the consumption of ideas to watching two great rhetoricians have it out in the Athenian assembly, or watching two parties play it out in an oppositional parliament like Westminster. And it creates new opportunities, putting ideas together and getting attention and winning fame and activating people's emotional responses, engaging people in ways which might be simply to hold their attention for long enough to get a like or an impression on Twitter that is enough for you to make some kind of money. So on Twitter, I think it's something like you have to get 5 million impressions, which is just people scrolling past your tweet. 5 million in 3 months, and then you can maybe get a few $100s or something like that. So you need then to make content that is going to provoke people or get people, or you need to follow other people who've got lots of followers and say shocking or offensive things to them, so people will look at your tweet and pause over it. And that's just a whole different technological, aesthetic economy for the production of ideas. And that's part of what we need to think about and understand.
And one last thing that connects back to what we were talking earlier, so in relation to utilitarianism and the possibility that the test here is sort of happiness. The ideas that will win are the ones that will make people happier. And one of the things that is true in the space of ideological entrepreneurs is there does seem to be a connection between, not everywhere, but in some prominent cases, between the promotion of ideas, including some quite serious ideas, and the thought that this is for your well-being. It's a kind of well-being industry. So Jordan Peterson's a good example of this. So Jordan Peterson is an interesting person, and he's done some interesting podcasts about the Bible. So whatever you think of them, there's some serious stuff out there. But he's a sort of well-being guru. And these two things have become quite closely connected, not just in his case, but in many cases, that ideas are for well-being. And the marketplace of ideas is a place in which ideas can be sold as for well-being. There's a kind of wellness version of the marketplace of ideas, which is quite prevalent. And that also feels a little different. It has its roots all the way back in this. I don't think any of this is entirely new. All of it you can find foreshadowed, in the 19th century. Utilitarianism is about well-being. That's what it is. It's a wellness industry. But the 21st century online version of it seems like it's gone further in that respect. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's an absolutely significant observation about the way in which the ideological entrepreneurs tend to act and tend to behave, which isn't always fully understood. So that even someone like Joe Rogan, who people have now heard of because he interviewed Donald Trump on his podcast. Rogan is a comedian and a commentator on martial arts and interviews all these people, but also promotes a certain lifestyle and a way of thinking about your body and fitness that will make your life better. An awful lot of people who are prominent on political parts of YouTube, often on the right or far right, often they'll sell you supplements or vitamins to make you healthier. They might sell you gold or a share in gold to make your finances secure. Or crypto, of course, crypto is absolutely suffused with spirituality. But they'll also sell their political ideas or rather their critique of the dominant system as something that will make you feel better. It'll help you understand what's going on. We can show you the truth about this, that, and the other. And that's an absolutely crucial part of what they are selling. And so, again, that takes us back not just to the 19th century, but to that Athenian marketplace in which St. Paul is selling spiritual well-being of a very particular kind.
Well, he's also selling Christianity, let's be honest. It's not just a generalized sense of feeling better about yourself. He's selling the good news about the Christ Jesus.
He is. Yeah, he is. But so there's a lot of things now we have to try and understand, which is, so on the one hand, we have this new form of communication that is promoting all these kinds of spiritual ideas. We also have political communication that is, according to my earlier argument, somewhat untethered by the mainstream political process. So it can't really be processed by political parties, put forward propositions and have votes and make things potentially law. We've got an awful lot of politics that is going nowhere. It's just there to be expressed, to be enjoyed as expression for the person who makes it to feel good or to attract an audience and make money, but it can't be processed. And that creates a kind of running of the engines that get hotter and hotter with nowhere to actually go, which is one part of the problem. But another part of the problem is that then political communication also becomes a very strange thing that is hard to distinguish from other forms of communication. But part of what we've evolved in different societies over time is the ability to recognize that this is a comedy show, this is a political speech, this is a lecture about John Stuart Mill. This is a spiritual guru. We can recognize the generic differences between these things and understand the different things that are happening in that situation. Online at the moment, these things get highly blurred. Am I watching a political speech or a spiritual guru? Am I being sold a product? Is this a commercial exchange or an exchange of intellectuals? Is this an entertainment? What is this? And I think that's profoundly destabilizing our ability to think about and understand and share political ideas. Often the angry exchanges that occur online are precisely because one person thinks one thing is going on, it's a joke. Someone else thinks it's a profound political statement. Someone else thinks it's just a big laugh. And that causes all kinds of confusion. So we've lost some of the generic distinctions, I think, there, on the one hand, and we've lost a way to connect political debate about ideas to some kind of meaningful process of decision-making. And although that has some similarities to the Agora or the 19th century, I think that's also a profoundly new situation, particularly when you factor in the volume and the speed at which all of that is happening.
And it's, I think, crucially, it's not really a place in the way you said at the beginning, the marketplace is a place. We sometimes used to talk about it as cyberspace, and the thought was it was the other place where we lived that other part of our lives. And you would go there, you would go online. None of that language makes any sense anymore. It's not another place. It's the air that we breathe.
But it's also a machine or a series of machines, and machines that want us to stay on those machines to access the rest of it through X or Facebook or YouTube rather than find it from any other way, and are continually doing so in ways that have economic value underpinning them. And not just cash value, of course, it's also a place where one can try and gain forms of social capital, social status, and that completely overdetermines the communicative exchanges that happen upon it. So this is a good point to come back to Jordan Peterson, because one of the ways in which that fast-moving, high-volume, unclear space, we don't know what's happening, one of the ways that can be made to make sense is by fixating on the particular individuals who are communicating to us. the top players, the ideological entrepreneurs with the highest rewards, become, I think Peterson is absolutely the archetypal case of this, and he probably liked being called an archetype because he likes archetypes. He is a charismatic guru figure who is promoting spiritual insight, as well as, unlike St. Paul, who of course wanted to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, Peterson is also promoting political ideas. So now we have a medium in which individuals are, through their headphones, hearing in their heads particular kinds of charismatic individuals who are speaking to them about all manner of things in a way that is very different from academic classes, newspapers, all other kinds of communication. But also, crucially, someone like Peterson is in competition with other purveyors of that sort of communication, that sort of talk. So there's a reason why someone like Peterson is so hostile to the university and so hostile to mainstream media. And it's not just because he has a more or less or whatever, however legitimate critique it is. It's because he is in market competition with them. And a lot of these ideological entrepreneurs are fundamentally in competition with what you used to do and what I do for a living, with what the journalists do for a living. And part of what we're seeing here, I think, is the squeezing out of those older forms of idea production and dissemination for this new market form.
Speaking, as we were, of the marketplace of ideas and indeed of podcasting business models, I just wanted to remind you that if you're thinking of Christmas gifts, we have a special Christmas gift offer. You can gift a subscription to PPF Plus to the recipient of your choice, and they will also get a hardback copy of my latest book, The History of Ideas, and I will inscribe it to that person with the message of your choice. We have already had lots of very touching messages, and I am hard at work inscribing away. To find out how to receive that or to give it, just go to our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in the show description. You can also give regular gift subscriptions there, 6 months and 12 months, and you can also have a look at our not extensive but lovely range of merchandise. You may also be aware, for reasons that we have been discussing over the past weeks and months and maybe even years, that there has been a bit of an exodus from X, formerly Twitter, to do with Elon Musk. Whatever your views are on that, we just wanted to let you know that you can also find us, as you can find many people now, on Blue Sky. We are at PPF Ideas, so find us and follow us there. And one more thing, at the risk of overburdening you with housekeeping, there is a new edition of our newsletter out tomorrow. It's free to subscribe. You just click on the link in the show description. Go to the website, all our past newsletters are there. This one will accompany the first 3 episodes in our Bad Ideas series, including the one on the silent majority. If you would like to, in our newsletter, we have a Trump or Nixon quiz. See if you can tell who said what. Our next episode is the second of my conversations with Alan Finlayson, and this time we're talking about a very big topic, but one that has a specific application in politics, including in British politics. We're going to be talking about what is wrong with the idea of modernisation. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.